a group of men would pop up, and the young girls and women of the time would scream and scream, and the grown-ups would wring their hands. Was it a rite of passage, some threshold to puberty we all had to cross? Was it the hormones in the milk? I decided to find out under the guise of writing my undergraduate thesis. When I discussed this with a friend, she said, "It's probably some sort of sex thing," which I scoffed at. But a year later, and she was basically right. It's kind of a sex thing. You need to understand when and how the teenage girl was created. Societal expectations for women and girls in the early 20th century were conservative. Girls were expected to remain chaste until they were married, and then have and raise a family. There were no real alternate paths, at least not for good girls, and none were publicized or shown in a way that allowed girls to see them as viable futures for themselves. Even nurses and teachers, it was assumed, would eventually marry and retreat into domesticity. High school enrollment increased over the early 20th century, which created a social space where young people could gather and afforded them more leisure time. From there, youth culture, the set of norms, language, interests, and dress that is exclusive to adolescents and young adults, slowly emerged. Popular Science Monthly has been credited with the first use of the word teenager in 1941. An increase of adolescent workers due to World War II. The number of adolescent workers rose 300% between 1940 and 1943. And the absence of a generation of young men created a predominantly young female populace. As these young women acquired more leisure time and income, they began creating identities that had more to do with the things they and their peer groups liked. They were distinct from the interests of children and weren't just mimicking adults. Music, and music fandom in particular, became an escape. A way to subvert and push against the restrictive social order of the day. Teenagers' friendships with each other were beginning to replace their relationships with families as the most important in their lives. A Life magazine article from 1944 called them fixated on fitting in. Advertisers took notice of this growing group of consumers and focused their attention specifically on high school girls, who were perceived as having more leisure time than boys, since they were not expected to be providing for their families. 17 magazine launched in 1944 and told its readers, "You are the bosses of the business," a clear sign that tastemakers and advertisers recognized this new, powerful class of consumers and their desire to belong. But what they didn't understand was that this fixation on fitting in with their friends was more important than conforming to adults' societal expectations of their behavior. As these young women struggled to create distinct identities and groups for themselves, fantasizing about idols and the life they led was a way to create a specific group identity, an opportunity to explore options that were closed to them, and an outlet for pent-up desires to do and be something else, desires they may not have been conscious of. However, this idea of the teenage girl was radical. The United States was segregated in the 40s, and Black Americans did not experience the same scale of financial improvement as white Americans. My mom was 12 in 1964, a prime age to have caught the Beatlemania bug, but I never heard her talking about them as her favorite artists or listening to their music. I asked her why she wasn't a Beatles fan, and she said part of the reason was that her family didn't have a television. Growing up poor and black in segregated Mobile, Alabama, meant there was a whole realm of pop culture that was cut off. We listened to black radio, and that was all Motown, she told me. My brother and cousin were 6 years older, and we danced to what they danced to, and that was all black music. She said because of Ed Sullivan, she had heard of them, but nothing that black teenagers at the time were consuming had anything to say about the Beatles. They didn't cross over onto the black airwaves, so we didn't really listen. The music industry remained segregated for decades, and that segregation lingers today. So although we tend to think of teenage girls as encompassing girls of all races, at the beginning, the musical interests that were starting to be seen as